Warning, this documentary contains content that some listeners may find offensive. I'm out on a mission to discover more about Frank Soo, the first non-white man to play internationally for the England national football team. Frank was the first man of an Asian background to play in the English Football League, and I want to learn more about him. Significant efforts have been made over the last 10 years to discover more about his career and life, and yet, huge question marks still remain. I actually interviewed founder of the Frank Soo Foundation, Alan Lau, for my local radio station back in February 2022, and as soon as Alan told me about Frank's story, I knew I wanted to create a documentary around him. I found it hard to believe that as a keen sports fan myself, and someone who is passionate about inclusivity and change in football, I hadn't heard of Frank before. And that led me to the question, why is that the case? Very few English sporting fans know about Frank, and I'm setting out to change this in this documentary and understand why in 2023, a trailblazer for ethnic minorities in football and sport generally isn't better known. Frank was born in Derbyshire in 1914, his mother was English, his father was Chinese. Frank played for the likes of Stoke City, Leicester City and Luton Town, and following an illustrious playing career, his focus shifted to management, taking charge of various Scandinavian domestic and international teams before returning to England. To start this adventure, I've arranged a chat with Susan Gardiner, writer of The Wanderer, The Story of Frank Soo. The book was published in 2016 and took Susan several years to write. Susan's a historian and a writer with a keen interest in football and also underrepresented people in history. Susan was the pioneer in unearthing more about Frank's career, and without her fantastic research, I wouldn't be creating this documentary. Can you walk us through Frank's childhood? What was it like for him growing up as a child with an East Asian background in England in the early 20th century? And what was it like for his family when he was born and started to grow up?
Well, it's quite interesting that his parents actually got married around the time that there were some anti-Chinese riots going on in the country, particularly in Liverpool, Manchester and Cardiff, which were ports, and there was a bit of a number of Chinese people had come into the ports and settled into the country, and there was a lot of resentment towards them because they felt they were taking people's jobs and sort of working for lower pay and so on, the usual kind of resentment towards immigrants. And I suspect that's why they moved away from the northwest and why Frank was born in Buxton in Derbyshire. But they eventually returned to Liverpool when things had calmed down and brought up their 7 children and ran a laundry in West Derby in Liverpool, which was actually quite well known and popular.
Because sort of Soo's life sort of as a professional footballer really took off at Stoke when he signed in January 1933. What's the media's reaction to this at the time? So was he actually outed as a footballer for being Chinese?
I'm not sure it was sort of hostile at all. I think the way it was treated initially was it was regarded as a novelty. You know, I mean, they did say, you know, Stoke City have just signed a Chinaman, but that was the way the term that people used in those days. They were intrigued by the fact that this young, very young, talented Chinese player had joined Stoke City, I think, rather than hostile towards him. Then he just became so popular with the fans at Stoke that I think that actually didn't become an issue. Although all the coverage of his playing by newspapers, they always mentioned he was Chinese or Chinaman or whatever, you know, and there were some racist cartoons, which we would regard as racist now, but I don't think people thought they were being mean then, where he's got a sort of long pigtail down his back, exaggerated features and so on, and stupid jokes about his name, so he probably had to put up with a lot. I think what changed things for him really was when the war broke out, because he, like a lot of players, he joined the forces and served in the RAF for the whole of the Second World War. He played for the RAF football team and was captain of it, and he also was selected for England in the sort of wartime matches. And I think that it seemed to have been a real sea change in the attitude of the press towards him, because he no longer was referred to as a Chinaman. He was always referred to as RAF captain and England player.
Do you actually think that Frank was unlucky then not to get called up to England pre-World War II?
I feel very strongly that he would have been picked before the war. He was just reaching the peak of his career, really. He was in his mid-20s when war broke out. And there was a campaign in the press, letter writing from fans, Stoke fans, and also some journalists, who were saying, why hasn't this wonderful young player been picked for England? Quite a few comments about it, and I think there was distinct pressure for him to be picked. I think, though, when the war broke out and suddenly everything changed, attitudes changed, and they did choose him, sadly, it meant he didn't get an official cap. And the first game that he was selected for, he was on the team sheet for, which would have been an official cap, he had to pull out with an ankle injury, and he was replaced by Billy Wright, who was the upcoming young player then and never looked back.
Get the ball away, and the best thing that Cullis can do as Lowry comes chasing down is to put it out to Scott. Scott on the
Now, despite playing for England during the war, Frank does make his debut against Wales in May 1942 in Cardiff. What was the media's reaction to this, given the magnitude of this debut?
I don't get the impression that for most people it mattered. I think what mattered was that he was in the RAF. He was photographed with other players like Stanley Matthews and so on, and Joe Mercer in their RAF uniforms, and that was part of the sort of whole morale boosting propaganda movement.
Now, unfortunately, due to the time period, of all the 9 games Frank played for England during the war, only 2 are available on extract for radio purposes. Here's a clip of Raymond Glendenning commentating on Frank's final match on the 20th of October 1945 at the Hawthorns against Wales.
It's quickly taken by Mercer. Mercer way downfield. Stubbins beaten in the air by Bob Davis again, but he's headed it to Stan Matthews on the England right wing. Matthews, a nice pass down for Stubbins to get to, but Davis is as safe as a rock, and he's beaten centre forward to it and saved the position for Wales. Up to the Welsh left winger Edwards. Edwards trying to get through past Scott. And this time, a neat back pass by Soo finds Matthews. Matthews running into the centre circle for England. Puts the ball through to Barrett. He's right to on his own. And, he's missed it. No, he's going back again. And he can't get it again. And again, this time, Sidlow dives on the ball.
Now, there was an exception, because I know from his family that a newspaper published a cartoon which said, basically, he shouldn't be playing for England because he's not British. And he was very hurt by that. And that was sometime, towards the end of the war, I think. And his family told me that that's one of the reasons that Frank went abroad, because he was so hurt that, having given his all, really, for the country, he received that kind of reaction. So, although that wasn't common, or it certainly wasn't publicly said, there were elements of racism, and Frank himself said that he felt he would have been picked earlier for England if it hadn't been for what he called his Oriental blood, and he said that in an interview in 1975, which it obviously still, meant something to him. I think he was extremely hurt by it.
From your perspective, why do you think Soo's career has sort of been expelled from 20th century English football? And was actually the key reason racism? Was it because he was playing at a time where the media wasn't as influential as it is today?
I don't want to underplay the racism, because I think that had a very strong element in why he was forgotten about. But I also think that it was very largely to do with him playing in Scandinavia, and people didn't really, at that point, regard those countries as being important in football terms, especially the British press, really weren't looking at any countries outside the British Isles. So I think it was a combination of those two things, plus the fact that when he did come back to England and managed Scunthorpe for a season, he wasn't very successful, unfortunately. And I think if he had been successful at Scunthorpe, he might have gone on to manage other clubs.
Reflecting on my chat with Susan, it's clear there are a number of factors as to why Frank's career has been lost in time. Her excellent and precise research has been pivotal in finding out more about Frank, and without her, I am sure very little would be known about Frank's life. It's evident that racism has been a clear factor as to why Frank has been excluded from the history of 20th century English football. That cannot be denied. But other factors like the time in which he was playing and the fact the press didn't really care for those that left England certainly opened my eyes in a way I hadn't appreciated before. To gain another perspective, what about a man who relates to Frank personally, the man who really ignited Frank's revival and is leading the charge for change? I'm on my way to see Alan Lau, founder of the Frank Soo Foundation. Alan was born in London, his parents are from Hong Kong. Alan's been heavily involved in grassroots football over the last decade, hosting and organising events in Chinese and ESA, East and Southeast Asian communities. He's also involved with the ESA Hornets, that's Watford FC's supporters group, as well as being a community champion with the English FA. Alan, what was your initial reaction to hearing Frank Soo's name for the first time?
I didn't really believe it at first, to be honest, because I'd been doing things in grassroots football for about 10 years before that, and I'd say I'm not a huge football geek, but I do, I followed football as a child, so I'd imagine I know quite a bit. But then when I got I think it was an email from someone saying, oh, there's a crowdfunding page for Susan Gardner's book about Frank Soo, The Wanderer. And then when I looked at it, I was like, nah, it can't be. What? And then when he was explaining to me that he played for Stoke and he played for England, it's one of those things like, nah, are you sure? Like, how have I not heard of this before?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a bit of disbelief at first, but then the more I read up on it, and then when I did contact Susan, it was a game changer in a way to have someone who has made it to the top like he has. It makes you think, actually, we have someone here that we can celebrate. The idea that someone from a Chinese background has played for England, it's mind-blowing. It was just mind-blowing.
What was your initial feeling as to why his career wasn't well known, and then how has that changed since you've started the foundation? Do you believe it was a racial aspect? Do you believe it was at the time when football was played? Because of course, as we know, football has changed a lot in 50 years in multiple ways.
I think there's quite a few reasons. There are lots of stories out there similar to this, not just Frank. There's a lot of forgotten people out there. He just got lost. He just got lost in time, I think, a lot of this. I think a lot of it is no one really took the time to care, I don't think, which is a shame. And I think actually talking to the family too, they all knew they had a famous family member. But I think for them too, it's like it didn't really click what it actually meant and how it can mean something to other people. Yeah, I think it just got lost with the whole list of all the people forgotten in football, especially in the wartime. They lost their careers to it, so that's a big part of it. And of course, the racial aspects must play a part of it. In retrospect, there are other people that I found who were of East or Southeast Asian backgrounds who played professional football, and no one really took the time to think, oh, actually, is it that bit special that, this person from a different background? I mean, it is special and it isn't special. And then I think a lot of these things, it can mean nothing, but it can mean the world to someone.
So you set up the Frank Soo Foundation in 2017. What was the reason for setting it up? And was anyone else involved in the process?
At that time, for me, it was always a thing in the back of my mind that was, okay, that's just the thing we did on the side. But one of the things that had the biggest effect on me is COVID with lockdowns, because coming from an East Asian background, I felt that we had a target on our back, because obviously where COVID came from,
started,
and, and then there was a lot of racism against us, and it was very hard to take. I just felt that, and then spending time with my kids and thinking, let's try and do something positive here. I mean, there's lots of people out there doing other things which are really, important to fight against racism and be more inclusive. But then I'm thinking more, how can we make a positive effect? And I felt that, okay, I've got this vehicle, the Frank Soo Foundation, and there's so much we can do to make it positive, really, to bring our communities out and be part of the wider community. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're doing at the foundation all fits in with this, I hope. And I hope that Frank is proud of that, because I think reading his book, reading his story, I feel sometimes that he was trying to get away, because he spent so much time in Scandinavia, didn't really spend that much time in England, and I hope that we can do something that could be a home.
Chatting with Alan was fantastic, and certainly gave me insight of a man who recognises the struggles that Frank would have gone through during his lifetime. You could hear at the end how emotional Alan's voice was and how much the foundation really means to him. What I found most interesting was when Alan mentioned about having a target on his back because of COVID. Similarly to how Susan described, it's not only the obvious racism that comes to mind, but it's also in the microaggressions that really affect the victims of it. It's in the subtlety, like not being picked because of how you look, that is undoubtedly racist and discriminatory. And that relates entirely to what Alan was speaking about. It's nothing, and yet it's something. Ronnie Soo, nephew of Frank, has kindly agreed to chat to me over the phone, revealing some insight into Frank's personal character and giving a different perspective, given his personal relation to Frank. Hi Ronnie, thanks for talking to me today. What were your first memories of Frank?
I was quite a young kid when he was alive. My dad would say, like, Uncle Frank might be coming over, he'd turn up in, like, he had a flashy Volvo car, like the Saints, if you remember the Saints. He'd turn up in that every so often whenever he came over from Sweden, because he was coaching. This would have been early 70s. Some of my first memories or whatever, he'd come over every so often, and I'd occasionally get postcards from him, just to think, how are you doing? And he'd ask things like, I don't see you training with Liverpool, why not?
What would you say his character was like? People often refer to him as a working class hero, and I know you were young, but did he strike you as someone like that? Was he an uncle you looked up to?
Certainly because I have several older brothers, they would have done, because they'd say, like, he played football. Whenever he'd be here, he was a coach, and he'd try to train the older brothers, and he'd have them doing push-ups and whatever. He'd be like, because he was still a fit man even long after he retired, and he'd be like, come on, get cracking. And he'd do things like pass a medicine ball around and expect them to keep up with him, which we never always could.
And what's your opinion on Frank's wartime caps not counting?
Disappointed but not surprised is the answer to that. They weren't recognised. There's a lot of action that's taken place in more recent years now, but at the time, it was very much. He was thought of as the Chinese boy. There was cartoons at the time. One we've got a photostat of him done out in sort of like a Chinese character with a football at his feet, and my dad hated that. Of course, we'd like to see that recognised, but the wheels of the FA move quite slowly.
When Frank moved back to England after his managerial career in Europe, what do you remember of his later life? When he moved back here, did you see him more often?
I didn't, unfortunately. I mean, when he was back in England, I think by then He was suffering from what's now known as Alzheimer's disease, and he was in care in, like, I think it would have been like the Stoke-on-Trent area, wasn't it, at the time? The last I saw him, I think, would have been around like 1980, or the early 80s certainly. He was still like quite well turned out then, but in later years he did deteriorate. So we didn't really get to see anything of him in those days. So yeah, 1991, it would have been like he was. We pretty much didn't have much to do with him by that point.
And why do you think then that Frank's career has been expelled from the history of English football?
Because the mindset of the country at that point was completely different to how it is now. It wasn't anything like as diverse as it is now. So I don't think it was conscious, but in terms of being forgotten about. I don't know. I don't know whether that's the whether you could say, oh yeah, he was enough Chinese, we'll forget about him. I don't think it was quite as cut and dried as that.
That family relationship from Ronnie really shined a new light for me on why Frank's career had been forgotten, and I cannot imagine how it feels to them having to wait for Frank's brilliant career to be recognised. But there is hope that the FA will award him official caps for his time playing for England during the war. What about somebody who actually played for Frank? Now, we've looked at an English perspective, but I'm fascinated to learn more internationally. I'm currently on my flight to Sweden, Stockholm to be exact, and I'm due to meet up with Pelle Kottschak, Djurgården IF club historian and board member, who's going to act as a translator for Hasse Tvilling. Hasse, also known as Hans, is 94 and is one of the most iconic men in Swedish sporting history. Him and his twin brother Stig, nicknamed Stickan, are 2 of 5 men to play internationally for Sweden in ice hockey and football. Hasse won the league with Djurgården in 1954-55 under Soo, which was arguably the peak of Frank's managerial career. Now, very little is known about Frank's time in Sweden, so it'll be amazing to hear a first-hand account of someone who remembers him and what his character was actually like.
Thank you for choosing to love with us, and have a good day. For current.
Hasse, on behalf of the Frank Soo Foundation, it's an honour and a privilege to interview you today, and thank you for giving up your time to talk to us. So when Frank first arrived, what was the initial reaction? Had any of the players heard of Frank? And, I mean, really, did the squad realise the trailblazer that he was in England, in Sweden?
Han dök bara upp, kan man säga. Och var väldigt noggrann just med...
He just came to the club. They didn't know so much about him before. Then he got a little bit angry. Hasse and Stickan and the man Tumba playing ice hockey. So he said to them, stop with that ridiculous game. But he changed rather soon about that item, so it was okay to play ice hockey.
And then when Frank arrived, were you expecting to win the league? What was the feeling around the club when he joined?
Men när han kom var vi liksom favoriter att vinna allsvenskan. Det var... Ja, just det, men just det. Ni blev favoriter tack vare honom. Och just det. He said that they became favorites because of Frank Soo. Yes, they have a good reputation. He had a good reputation. And then we are coming to the most important thing for us in Djurgården, because they were training so hard. They were running around the town, de sprang runt stan. Our nickname is the Iron Stoves, järnkaminerna, and it was because of that thing, because we were so, we trained so more compared to the other teams.
Frank was described in Swedish as a slavdriver, which means taskmaster in English. Does Hasse think this is a fair description? Is that accurate of Frank's character?
Han var en väldigt slavdrivare.
Yes, he was a slavdrivare, and we always won the second half of the matches because our condition was so good.
Frank in England was described as the smiler, so someone who was really positive, really happy. Can Hasse say the same? Was Frank really smiley during his time at your garden?
No, opposite. Not directly. But after the gold medal, efter guldet he laughed.
Det var Frank med.
Okay, Frank joined the party, but he still checked so they didn't drink too much. It was only 3-4 people that he was forced to watch Frank Soo, because most of the people didn't drink. Hasse didn't drink. Maybe because of that we were so good.
And then in the summer of 1955, Frank suddenly terminates his contract with Djurgården. Was that a surprise to the team? Were the team expecting the manager to leave so suddenly? Or was there an explanation given to them?
Nej, jag vet inte vad jag ska säga. På sätt och vis var vi glada.
Both way, actually. Because they were not so... Also, they liked him, but he was... han var rather strong in his meaning, so they missed him. So they missed him, but they didn't go down to the floor and cry when he said that he should go to another club. But
if Hasse had to sum up Frank in 3 words, what would those words be?
Han var en mycket bra tränare, men kanske lite för hård.
He was a very good trainer, a little too hard, a little too much. Thank you for coming here to Stockholm.
Thank you for coming here to Stockholm.
It was an absolute honour meeting Hasse, and after recording, he told me that from the 1954-55 team, he is the only player from their historic season that's still alive, emphasising how long ago the time period was. Hasse's memory is remarkable, and it's clear that Frank came with a vision for the club, and despite the squad not enjoying Frank's vigorous training methods, they certainly worked and he delivered success. It's sad though Frank left so abruptly, and I don't think we'll ever find answers now given the time period. By all accounts, Soo didn't experience racism during his time coaching at Djurgårdens. However, after Djurgårdens, Frank bounced from club to club, and therefore, more research will have to be conducted to fill in these gaps about what his experience might have been with other people's attitudes towards him. Given that many clubs he went to, football was viewed as an amateur sport, it may be hard to find further accounts, but Hasse proves there are still some people alive that remember. After all of this, what does the future look like for the Frank Soo Foundation? I went to visit Alan for a final time to understand the landscape for the future of the foundation. When you started the foundation then, what were the initial aims, and did you ever expect it to grow in the way it did?
So our 3 aims are to obviously tell his story, so more people know about him. Secondly is to work with other East and Southeast Asian communities. Finally, to support anyone involved in football from an East and Southeast Asian background, and just provide support and help them in their footballing journey. And I feel those 3 things are still very important to us, and it's just got bigger. It's just got more things have been we've got more projects, more ideas, and there's more scope of things that we can do together with other people, because there's a lot of work out there to do. There's a lot of things that we can do to do these 3 things and help and contribute.
Overall, I've absolutely loved this journey of discovering more about Frank Soo. Stories like this need to be read and shared by people to start making change around racism in football. There is no denying that the damaging element for Frank was the time in which he played. Having researched, I feel the unfortunate timing of his career certainly contributed to his annihilation from the history of 20th century English football. And the central theme that is noted throughout is race. However, it must be said, Frank is and forever will be a trailblazer for ethnic minorities in England participating in sport. The disregarded nature of his life and his career, both on and off field, cannot take away from the history attached to his name. He changed clubs alike wherever he went, and the Djurgården fans alone note that their success that followed after Frank left was solely attributed to him. Our enthusiasm for inclusivity around sports and clubs today needs to increase tenfold, so more stories like Frank's don't get overlooked, but are celebrated and used as pillars of change. If that does happen, change will come. This documentary was produced, scripted and edited by Lewis Pears. Many thanks to those involved for participating in my documentary. Special thank you also to BBC Archives and Tariq Hussain for granting access to use their archive audio of Raymond Glendenning's commentary. Finally, special mention to the Frank Soo Foundation and Alan Lau for making all of this possible. For further inquiries, please contact lewis.pears@gmail.com or at LP Broadcasts on Twitter. Thank you for listening.